What's good, y'all? Welcome back to the Playmaker's Corner podcast. I am your host for today, Simon Villanos, aka Coach V. It is March 4th, 2026 when I am recording this, and we have hit a milestone here at the Playmaker's Corner. This is episode 500. Woo! Yes, you have heard that correctly. We have done at least 500 episodes of the Playmaker's Corner, and honestly, I think that's 500 official episodes. There are a couple episodes that went unnamed, so we probably got past the 500 episode mark officially a lot sooner. But, this is official. This is PMC episode 500, and, on this one, we're going to be talking about some great women's college flag football that happened over this last weekend, week 3, and not just the weekend, but the week as well. Like I said, week 3, which basically went from February 23rd to February 28th. And you know what? There's a lot that happened. Make sure you check out episode 499 to see the recap of all that happened. But on this episode, we are going to recognize some great players from week 3, as well as ranking some teams here at the end as we see our biggest changes in our rankings since we've started them, arguably, back a couple years ago. And so, without further ado, let's just go ahead and hop right into episode 500. And we will start this episode by talking about Playmaker of the Week. This goes to the best playmaker that we deem here, the best performance or the most impactful performance that an athlete had last week. And this could be any level as long as it's a varsity team, NAI, junior college, D2, D3, whatever, right? And really what it came down to, there are a lot of great ones. Of course, if you checked out our recap, you could hear our playmakers of the game. All those players are pretty much considered for this one, but we narrowed it down to 3 finalists for this week. Number 1 is Life's receiver, Altiera Gooch. She had a great week. The stats are pretty decent, right? Over 100 yards, a touchdown, right? But the way she got those yards was really important. She had 2 big 30-plus yard plays that both set up touchdown drives. And then in overtimes, both of them, she caught scores, right? That eventually led to Life winning the game. And so, obviously, that was clutch, because that was maybe the biggest win in Life's program history. That's the first time they have ever beat Thomas, and so that's definitely an accomplishment in itself. The other player we were considering is also in the Sun Conference, and that is Warner's Catherine Hutchinson. She has been on an absolute tear lately versus St. Leo, 430 yards, 10 touchdowns. Bruden Parker, 298 yards and 7 touchdowns, has played nearly perfect, and on top of that, Warner is not only undefeated, but they are a very dominant undefeated currently at the moment. And so Catherine Hutchinson had to be somebody that we considered. But last but not least, there's another player that we looked at, and it was Sawyer Rigdon of Barden College in her performance versus Virginia Wesleyan, where she had 552 yards and now a new women's college flag football record of 15 passing touchdowns. Also had 44 rushing yards here in their first ever win as a program. Barden College has never, this is their first season, right? So in their first game, they went ahead and won that one. So congrats to them, obviously. But that's absolutely massive. I could be wrong about the record part, but I am very positive that nobody else has thrown for 15 touchdowns in a game. And so there you go there. But there can only be one Playmaker of the Week here for week 3. And we are going to go ahead and pick Sawyer Rigdon of Barden College, their quarterback. Like I said, a historic performance and a historic win to go ahead and start out that program's history. So there you go. Your week 3 Playmaker of the Week is Sawyer Rigdon of Barden College. Okay, now let's move on and talk about fantasy point leaders from week 3. And yes, you heard that correctly. Basically, if stats are provided, we go ahead and put it into a fantasy football points calculator. Shout out simulatedfootball.com. We use ESPN standard, except for passing touchdowns. That's the only difference there, because those touchdowns aren't 6, to ESPN standard. I make it 6. And so I put in all the other stats and then I add on the touchdowns there. But basically, we're going to be talking about the players that had the biggest statistical performances and impacts, at least offensively for the most part, from this last week. And this week I'm doing something a little bit different here. I'm going to split up total fantasy point leaders by quarterbacks and non-quarterbacks. So I'm just going to say right now, if there's a player that I missed, because it is a lot of stats to go through, feel free to reach out. We're always trying to be better and stay on our toes and whatnot, but we want to make sure that we cover as many players as possible here. And so for this week, that's what I'm doing. Maybe next week we go back to quarterbacks and skill players, but it was a very quarterback heavy week. I mean, it has been so far. And so let's go ahead and actually talk about the most points, the total fantasy points scored by a non-quarterback. So just skill players for now. Starting with number 10, we have Omariah Gordon of Warner versus St. Leo. 5 receptions, 109 yards, 2 touchdowns. That's good for 27.9 points. And then versus Bruden Parker, 146-yard touchdowns, but did get 3 picks, including a pick 6. That's good for 23.6 points for a total of 51.5. Moving on to number 9, we have Sania Waller of Baker. She actually has some passing here, but she's technically a utility player versus Midland. And by the way, only 3 games listed for stats. They played another game in Arizona, but for some reason there's no stats for that one. So she probably did better than this. But anyways, versus Midland, 34 passing yards, 1 interception, 14 rushing yards, 7 receptions, 46 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown for a total of 18.36 points. Versus Ottawa, Arizona, OUAZ, 2 rushing touchdowns, 3 receptions for 24 yards and 1 touchdown, good for 23.4 points. And then versus Arizona Christian, 1 rushing touchdown, 3 receptions for 27 yards, good enough for 11.7 points, for a grand total of 53.46. Next up is Jaden, I think it's Hires or Hears of Ferrum here, the receiver, but against Lindsey Wilson had a big day. 6 receptions, 196 yards, a touchdown, and also caught a pick. That's 33.6 points. And then versus Hollins, 2 receptions for 71 yards and 2 touchdowns, good for 21 points or 21.1. And so that's good for 54.7 total points. Moving on to number 7 here is Krista Quinn of Milligan. Played 3 games, one versus Mars Hill, where she had 3 receptions for 13 yards and 2 touchdowns for 16.3 points. Against Huntington, had 8 receptions for 81 yards and a touchdown for 22.1 points. And then against Campbellsville, 6 receptions, 65 yards, and a touchdown for 18.5 points. Good enough for 56.9 points total. Moving on to number 6, we have Jessica Finley of Warner here versus St. Leo. 5 receptions, 92 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 pick 6, good for 34.2 points. Versus Bruden Parker, 3 receptions, 27 yards, 2 touchdowns, 3 picks, good for 23.7 points, for a total of 57.9. Now going in at number 5, we have Addison Cadwell of Wingate here. Versus Reinhardt, 4 receptions, 98 yards, 3 touchdowns, also caught a pick, good for 33.8 points. Versus Ottawa, 6 receptions, 32 yards, and 2 touchdowns, good for 21.2 points. And then versus Kaiser, 3 receptions for 11, good for 3.1. Still, though, good enough for 5th place, 58.1 points here on the week so far. And I would say that is the highest score from Colorado, but that is just not true, at least not yet. At number 4, we have Gwen Carter of Emmanuel, their wide receiver, versus King. 11 receptions, 190 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 2 picks, good for 58 points flat. And then against Lisa McGray, a little bit of a lighter load, 1 reception for 32 yards for 4.2 points. Now at 3 is that other Colorado player I was talking about. That is Avalon Lux Offerman of Warner versus St. Leo. 5 receptions, 62 yards, and a touchdown for 17.2 points. Versus Bruden Parker, though, 12 receptions, 151 yards, and 3 touchdowns for 45.1 points, for a grand total of 62.3 points. At number 2 is Gianna Brown of Emmanuel versus King. 6 receptions, 101 yards, 2 touchdowns, good for 28.1 points. And then versus Lisa McGray, 15 receptions, 141 yards, and 2 touchdowns, good for 41.1 points, for a grand total of 69.2 points. And then at number 1, the number 1 skill player scorer this week was Ashley Clam of Kaiser versus Ottawa, 5 receptions, 44 yards, 2 touchdowns. That's 21.4 points. Versus Reinhardt, 3 receptions, 42 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 picks, 17.2 points. And then versus Wingate, 4 receptions, 98 yards, 3 touchdowns, good for 31.8 points for a grand total of 70.4 points. That is your total fantasy points leader as far as non-quarterbacks go. Now, as far as quarterbacks go, let's go ahead and hop right into it. At number 10 is Ottawa's quarterback Anna Anderson versus Wingate, 258 yards, 3 touchdowns, 34 rushing yards as well for 37.22 or 72 points versus Kaiser, 231 yards, 3 touchdowns, 89 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns for 30.14 points for a grand total of 67.86 points. Now, it is worth noting that she played a game against Florida Gateway, but there are no stats there, which is very unfortunate. So, there you go, but still sitting at number 10. At number 9 is Payson Shreve, at least that's how I believe you say that, Shreve, of Ferrum here, versus Lindsey Wilson, 401 yards, 6 passing touchdowns, 20 rushing yards for 54.04 points, versus Hollins, 192 passing yards, 6 passing touchdowns for 43.68 points. In 8th place is Emmanuel's quarterback Lillian Stevenson versus King, 422 yards and 9 touchdowns for 70.88 points, versus Lisa McRae, 227 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 picks for 17.08 points for a grand total of 87.96 points. Now, moving on here, this is the other Colorado player that I was talking about as well in, I think it's 7th place? In 7th place, we have Wingate's quarterback, Sailor Swanson, versus Reinhardt, 251 yards, 6 passing touchdowns, 30 yards, and a rushing touchdown for 55.04 points, versus Ottawa, 249 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 27.96 total points there, versus Kaiser, 153 yards, a touchdown, a pick, and 17 rushing yards, good enough for a respectable 11.74 points. In total, has 94.74 points here, playing a tough schedule here in week 1. Now, moving on here to 6, we have Ava Wallace versus Ottawa, 231 yards, 3 touchdowns, 22 rushing yards for 29.44 points, versus Reinhardt, 160 passing yards, 5 passing touchdowns for 36.4 points, and then versus Wingate, 303 yards and 6 passing touchdowns for 48.12 points for a grand total of 113.96 points there. So there you go there. Now, in 5th place is actually our Playmaker of the Week, Sawyer Rigdon of Barton College, versus Virginia Wesleyan, 552 yards, 15 passing touchdowns. Did throw a pick though, but had 44 rushing yards for a grand total of 114.48 points. I believe that is a new record for the season here, at least in single game, but we'll talk about that. That's a little bit of a spoiler, actually. We'll talk about that later here. Moving on to number 4, we have Amaya Pablo of Lindsey Wilson with another productive week versus Hollins, 275 yards, 13 passing touchdowns for 89 points, versus Ferrum, 156 yards, 2 touchdowns, 3 picks, but did have 110 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown for 29.24 points. Now, going into our top 3, at 3, we have Bridget Kaiser of Milligan versus Mars Hill, 215 passing yards, 6 passing touchdowns for 44.6 points, versus Huntington, a big game here, 369 yards, 6 passing touchdowns, and 11 rushing yards for 51.86 points, and then versus Campbellsville, 216 yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and a pick, and 16 rushing yards for 26.26 points, for a grand total of 122.7 points. Moving on to Baker, we have Tara Lorente, their quarterback, versus Midland, 145 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception, 66 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns for 40.4 points, versus OUAZ here, 216 yards, 4 touchdowns, 2 picks, 35 rushing yards, and another rushing touchdown for 38.14 points, and then versus Arizona Christian, 270 yards, 2 touchdowns, 53 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns for 46.10 points. And it is also worth noting that there is another game they played against Benedictine Mesa here, but for some reason, no stats, so that's unfortunate here because she probably would have overtaken number 1, but, you know, it is what it is. Now, your number one scorer in fantasy, total fantasy points this week was Captain Hutchinson, the quarterback of Warner here, versus St. Leo, 430 yards, 10 touchdowns, 19 rushing yards for 17 or 79.10 points. And then versus Bruden Parker, 298 yards, 7 passing touchdowns. Did have negative 2 rushing yards, but a rushing touchdown there for 59.72 points for a grand total of 138.82 points. That is your total fantasy point leader of week 3. Now let's go to individual game fantasy point leaders. For this one, I kept quarterbacks and non-quarterbacks, receivers, skill players together here. I'm going to be honest, I did not have time to separate these and thoroughly look through. But, it is what I have. Maybe next week I'll separate them. We'll see, though. But let's go ahead and start with an honorable mention. Avalon Lux Offerman versus Bruden Parker, 12 receptions, 151 yards, 3 touchdowns. She had 45.1 points, which is unfortunately just 0.1 points, 0.1 of a point, away from making her top 10. So right now she's at 11, but I figured because it's that close, I'll just mention her. Now at 10, we have Saren Merritt, at least I hope that's how you say that, out of Barton College, versus Virginia Wesleyan. This receiver had 8 receptions, 192 yards, and 3 touchdowns for 45.2 points. At number 9, we have Tara Lorente of Baker versus Arizona Christian. In that game, 270 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 53 rushing yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns for a grand total of 46.1 points there. At number 8, we have Ava Wallace, specifically versus Wingate. Had 303 passing yards and 6 passing touchdowns in that one. At number 7, we have Bridget Kaiser of Milligan versus Huntington. Had 369 passing yards, 6 passing touchdowns, 11 rushing yards for 51.86 points. At number 6 here, we have Sailor Swanson of Wingate versus Reinhardt. 251 yards, 6 passing touchdowns, 30 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown for 55.04 points. At number 6, we have the wide receiver at number 5, we have the wide receiver out of Emmanuel and Gwen Carter versus King. She had 11 receptions, 190 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Also caught 2 interceptions, so she had a total of 58 points there. At 4, we have Catherine Hutchinson versus Bruden Parker here. 298 yards, 7 passing touchdowns, and a rushing touchdown for 59.72 points. At 3, is Catherine Hutchinson again, this time versus St. Leo, 430 yards, 10 passing touchdowns, and 19 rushing yards for 79.10 points. At 2, we have Amaya Pablo of Lindsey Wilson versus Hollins, 275 yards, 13 passing touchdowns for 89 total points. And then at number 1, we have Sawyer Rigdon of Barton College versus Virginia Wesleyan. 552 passing yards, 15 passing touchdowns. Did throw a pick though, but also had 44 rushing yards for 114.48 total points there in that game. So there you go. That's your individual game fantasy point leaders from week 3. Alrighty, now let's go ahead and talk about fantasy football here. Yes, myself, Cody, and Gina are in a PMC fantasy league together, but instead of professional players, we have women's college flag football players that we have picked, and so this is your weekly update of that. And to be honest, I know some people were listening at the beginning. I don't know if they're still listening. We'll see, but I figured it's a fun thing to talk about. Whoever gets the most wins at the end gets bragging rights. And currently, I am very sad to announce that Cody has won again for the second straight week here. We'll start at the top and go all the way down here. Couple updates. Currently, I am not including defenses, even though we drafted them. I don't know what's going on with our points simulator thing when it comes to defense, but it is not calculating those correctly, which is very interesting. Now, when players have like caught picks and they have offensive stats, it does. So I have no idea what's going on. So it is what it is. But here's the starting lineup the winning lineup that Cody had here. So I'll just name them off and then the points they got for this week here. Starting off with QB1 is Ava Wallace, or at least the first name listed here is Ava Wallace. She had 113.96 points. At 2 is Catherine Hutchinson, who has 138.82 points. Those two players are going crazy right now, by the way. I think those might be some of the highest scorers so far in the league. So there's that. At one of his wide receiver spots is Lindsey Wilson's Cadence Warmers, who had 26.5 points. The other one is Ashley Clam of Kaiser, 70.4 points. And then you have Alyssa Linkus of Ottawa with 25.2 points. Now, the flex was interesting. Addie Schillick was thrown in there because you have a couple players who haven't played yet. So there is that. And she had a solid 5.3 points. But Omariah Gordon of Warner, and by the way, Addie Schillick of William Woods, Omariah Gordon of Warner had 51.5 points, and that ended up being big time for Cody here, as his team had a total of 431.68 points. Now, I hate to say this, but I only lost, not 61, 431.68 points. Now, I hate to say this, but my team only lost by 13. In total, I had 418.78 points. Now, I will say this, there are some players who played and stats were not put in, and so I'm sure those 13 points would have easily been covered, but whatever. It is what it is. Let's go ahead and start at the quarterback position here. Tara Lorente, 124 points, .64. Lorente of Baker, by the way. Then we have Amaya Pablo of Lindsey Wilson, who I slotted in here. She had 118.24 points. We have Krista Quinn of Milligan, who had 56.9 points. Marley Spielberg of Ottawa, 25.8 points. Riley Bolser only played one game, but went crazy, 34.1 points, so love that. Tramisha Harris, 43.1 points, a little bit of a down week. And then Deshae Branham, I think, only played one game, only had 16 points there. For a grand total, 418.78. Not bad. There are some injuries here. I thought Alex Odom would maybe be back by now. Same with Destiny Lockett. So definitely disappointed there, but hoping they come back healthy and stronger than ever for sure, though. And then we have Gino, who is almost 100 points behind Cody. Not really. That's a little much here. But losing by 70 to Cody and another losing by 70 to Cody and then basically 50 to me is not great. But this is what his situation looked like. Had to start lose Ariana Herrera out of Weber and still had a good game. Just about a down one, just unfortunately only played one game, 23.88 points. Bridget Kaiser, though, had a great week, 122.7 points of Milligan. And by the way, Herrera of Weber. Sanaya Waller of Baker did her thing, 53.46 points there. Jessica Finley of Warner is on her tear, still 57.9 points there. Caitlin Sigmundy, I wouldn't say had an off game, just a quiet game. He had some other players. Riley Bolser really turned it up this week, so there's that. But only 4.6 points. Avalon Lux Offerman, though, of Warner, had a great week here, 62.3 points, as well as Warner's Anna Vincenzini, who had 36.5 points, for a grand total of 361.34 points. So, there you go. Those are the updates as of right now. We have each picked up players, so I'm just going to name off all the waiver updates, starting with Gino. I don't know if I said this last week, but I'm going to say it anyways. He has added Anaheim Morales of Hope, their quarterback, Luzariana Herrera of Weber, which we all know right now. And then he has also added Carly Yoakley of Lindsey Wilson at wide receiver. Cody only had one pickup here, and there were no stats for her, unfortunately, here. But actually he had two pickups, he had two pickups. But still, there are no stats for one of them. Lydiana De Silvia of Daytona State, a wide receiver DB, and then obviously he has also picked up Cadence Warmers of Lindsey Wilson. And then I also made some moves here. I think I mentioned Alex Odom from Campbellsville, but I picked her up. I also picked up Tramisha Harris from Kaiser. And then, of course, I had to get Amaya Pablo of Lindsey Wilson. And then I am also adding Addie Cadwell. I'm a little biased, but, it's my team. I don't care. But Addie Cadwell of Wingate here, looking to be their wideout one, at least in what I've seen. She has got wideout one production. So, hey, shout out Sailor, and shout out the Colorado girls doing their thing once more. But there you go. That is your PMC Fantasy Football League update of the week. Alrighty, now let's go ahead and talk about these rankings, these much anticipated rankings, because so much happened here in week 3. Just as a quick reminder, I know some games have already happened here in March, but these are the rankings as of March 2nd. Really, March 3rd is when we got these rankings in, but not including any of the games that have been played in March so far. These are including the games that have been played from February 23rd to February 28th, that last Saturday, I think, was the last day where games were played that really mattered to these rankings. So there you go there. Just as a reminder, myself and the rest of this panel, we rank teams 1 through 25. If any of us rank a team at 1, they get 25 points, 2, 24, 3, 23. I add up all the points. That basically averages out. And then the team with the most points gets ranked highest, right? And so there is definitely the possibility that, some teams have the same amount of points because we all have different rankings. We have the PMC rankings, which is the averaged out rankings that I am telling you about right now. And then we have individual rankings that you will hear about here as well, as I will be reading the notes and comments that, some of our voters had concerning some of these squads. So there you go. But just as a reminder, last week here, these were the rankings just out with Southwestern, Ferrum, Florida Memorial, Reinhardt Point, Mount St. Mary's, Alabama State, Arizona Christian, Hope International, Emmanuel, Huntington College, and Eastern. All of those teams were ranked by one of us here on the panel, but did not quite make our top 25. At 25, though, was Saddleback College, 24 Lisa McRae, 23 King, 22 Marymount, 21 St. Francis, 20 Irvine Valley, 19 Graceland, 18 William Woods, 17 Life, 16 Siena Heights, 15 Midland, 14 Daytona State. Tied at 12 was Campbellsville and Lindsey Wilson. I think I said 12 and 13 by accident last week, but Lindsey Wilson and Campbellsville were tied. At 11 was St. Thomas, 10 Wingate, 9 Weber, 8 Thomas, 7 Milligan, 6 Kansas Wesleyan, 5 Florida Gateway, 4 Baker, 3 Warner, 2 Kaiser, and at number 1 was Ottawa. Now, for this week, the teams that were getting votes here, getting ranked, but were just outside our top 25, and it was pretty close, mind you, but just outside is William Woods, who lost a tough one to Southwestern by a score, so there you go. Marymount at 10, who hasn't played a game yet, but other teams have moved up. Hope, Graceland, Point, St. Francis, who does move down a little bit. Arizona Christian, Cumberland, Alabama State, King, Emmanuel, and Cypress all got votes and ranked by somebody on our panel. So there you go. Now at 25, the first team here is Lisa McRae, who does move down a spot here. This is what Cody had to say about Lisa McRae. He said they hold on for a touch win over Emmanuel and get their stats amped with a dominant Chowan win to stay in the top 25. At least right now, they will be in the top 25. Moving on to 24, we have Southwestern, who does move up 2 spots here technically. Last week, they were just out at 26. This week, they move up with a win over William Woods here, so that does drop William Woods and bring up Southwestern, who is making its first appearance in our PMC top 25 for the first time ever. This is what Cody had to say. Gutsy banged up and yet a win to scooch the Jinx into the top 25. Gino had this to say about Southwestern. A very limited roster once again, but they pulled through and got revenge against William Woods in a 7-0 shutout to start the year 1-0. And so there you have it, Southwestern moving into our top 25 for the first time after being unranked, or not unranked, but just outside our top 25. Now at 23, also coming up for the first time ever, is Barton College here, coming off of a very dominant win. This is what Cody had to say about them. They set the record 120-0, winning 120-0. I'm not going to overreact the same way I did with Lindsey Wilson just yet, but kudos to the record setters. Our friend at Women's College Flag Football did have this to say. opened by making national headlines with an eye-popping 120-point win, securing the largest single game result in the country so far. So there you go there. Barden coming in at 23 and looking to potentially rise here, but in our top 25 for the first time. Now at 22 is Mount St. Mary's, who joins our top 25 for the first time, but was getting votes. Gino had this to say: the Mount are looking awesome so far with the 3-0 start to their season, with Jenna Dick balling out at quarterback for them. Women's college flag football had this to say: a historic debut as the first D1 school in the Northeast to add the sport. The Mount played their first ever game on February 28th, going 3-0. And that will be enough to go ahead and get them to move in to our top 25 here at 22 for the first time ever. Now, also moving up from being previously unranked is Nevada State. And I'll say this, by the way, they're at 21. We went back and forth between ranking them or not, but we realized that they are technically still a varsity team. Not sure about the level, but we are going to rank them regardless here. And so this is what Gino had to say about Nevada State here, who he has at 17. He said Nevada State is trying to claim the title as the best team in the West, or on the west side of the country. The recruiting is also fantastic since Nevada is already huge for girls flag football at the high school level. I have them ranked in my top 25 as well, and they have won the number of games that they've played in so far. It is a little hard to track because some teams are counting them as scrimmages or exhibitions and not putting down scores, but I believe as of right now, they are undefeated, and it's kind of by a lot, so there's definitely that going for them. But moving on, we have a team finally who is already here in our top 25 but has a nice rise up 5 spots, and that is Saddleback College. I will say a lot of that is thanks to other teams who have lost, and so Saddleback naturally just rises here. But this is what Women's College Flag Football.com said. He said the ultimate grinders of 2026, the 7-0 Bobcats, are navigating a tough JUCO gauntlet and are surviving every test. Gino had this to say: Saddleback is right there with Irvine Valley, competing for the best flag football college in California. Cody had this to say: still one of the only undefeateds in the country. They have had a few close calls, but are still pulling out wins and were red hot last week. So there you go there. Saddleback College moving up a couple spots here to 20. Now at 19 is Midland, who does drop 4 spots. Cody have this to say about Midland: shrugged off a brutal loss to Baker to bounce back with a win over Heston. I think the game against Kansas Wesleyan will tell us the most about Midland. Gino had this to say about Midland: that loss to Baker was not encouraging at all, but I'll keep Midland in the top 25 for now. We should get a very good idea of what this team is about when they play Kansas Wesleyan here on March 24th. And then I believe that is all the notes that we had on Midland there. But yeah, I mean, they played a tough opponent in Baker, and it just wasn't close. It was an ugly game, to be honest with you, and you obviously never want to see that, but it is what it is, right? And we knew that there would have to be some changes over there, or that there would be some changes over there, and that maybe it wouldn't be the smoothest transition in a new era with a new quarterback, right? But going against Heston, they looked pretty good. Now against Kansas Wesleyan, we are really going to see how well they can do. And at the time this releases, that game would have already happened. So we'll talk about that next week, though. But moving on, at 18, we have Irvine Valley, who moves up 2 spots, mostly because other teams have moved down a couple of spots. This is what Women's College Flag Football.com has to say. Making serious noise out west, they just took down a tough Grand Canyon club team, 37-26 to remain undefeated with a plus 133-point differential. Gino had this to say about Irvine Valley: this offense is looking unstoppable so far this season. Cody had this to say about Irvine Valley: Irvine Valley has been brutalizing teams and the offense remains red hot. I'm excited to see how the game against Ventura goes. And also in March, they'll play Cypress and Saddleback, who I'd say are the premier teams out of the 3C2A here, which is the JUCO program they have out of Cali. League they have out of Cali, so there you go. Now at 17 is Wingate, who does drop a couple of spots here. It is worth noting almost half of our voters dropped them out of their rankings. But let's go ahead and see what Cody has to say about Wingate here, who he has at 11 still. He says, I'm going to keep this squad standing pat right here. They had about as even-keeled of a performance that you can ask for, dismantling Reinhardt, going toe-to-toe with the only ever national champs, and then not closing the gap with Kaiser. This tournament should put them in great shape for the Conference Carolina play. Gino had this to say about Wingate. Hard-fought loss to Ottawa and then a bad loss to Kaiser. These are two extremely talented squads, and I'm still impressed with how Wingate handled themselves. Those two losses will make them much better for their conference games. And I gotta agree. I mean, look, I'm not gonna drop Wingate, right? They blasted Reinhardt. Which, I wasn't sure how that would go. Maybe I thought it would be closer, but that was the first game of the season, and they looked really good here. And then after that, they played Ottawa really close. Ottawa had to score in the last minute or so, the last couple minutes, to win that game. This was not a game that was decided in the third quarter. It was decided in the final minutes of the fourth quarter. And that does matter, like him or not, Ottawa still beat some decent teams here. And, I mean, look, if you're Wingate, to play the national champs toe-to-toe like that, that's definitely encouraging for a very young team over there. So, there you go. And, I mean, hey, I also might be biased. I'm just putting that out there. Shout out our Colorado athletes over there in Sailor Swanson, Addie Cadwell, Maddie Jones. You also have some other great players, too. Janelle Francis looked great. Electric out there. Yvonne Brusso is doing her thing per usual, right? Nothing we didn't see coming. So, really, I mean, look, this Wingate team is playing with some of these top tier teams as the first year program. That is definitely something. And so they're still in our top 25, but they do drop 7 spots, which is kind of crazy. Now, tied at 15 is Lindsey Wilson and Campbellsville. I think they were also tied last week. Let me double check. Yeah, they were. And then the week before they were not. Okay, so 2 weeks in a row tied, just in different spots here. And let's talk about Lindsey Wilson first. How about that? So this is what Cody had to say about Lindsey Wilson. He says they drop a couple spots here, but showed some guts in the second half. That I love to see. They do drop and are not invincible, but are to be monitored. Gino had this to say about Lindsey Wilson. Lindsey Wilson's week 3 consisted of a very interesting loss to Ferrum, followed by a monstrous win over Hollins. I'm only dropping them 1 spot since this offense really seems to be something special here. Women's College Flag Football.com said making early waves by winning 2 games by a combined 198-0, including a 111 win where the defense caught 9 interceptions before finally falling to Ferrum 39-19 here. Lindsey Wilson, they had a really hot start to the season. I think it's still the start to the season. And then they came back to earth a little bit against Ferrum here. And, Ferrum was a team that was getting votes in our top 25 here pretty much since the preseason. So we knew how good they would be. They'd probably be Lindsey Wilson's most quality opponent, at least to this date. And you know what? They got him. They got ahead in the second half. Lindsey Wilson tried to put something together, but just couldn't quite get there. That's definitely something. They're still a young team over there. We will see what happens for now, but they do drop a couple spots. Now, the team tied with them is Campbellsville. This is what Women's College Flag Football had to say about them. A strong start to the season with early wins over LaGrange and Huntington. Their only blemish is a loss to Milligan. Gino had this to say about Campbellsville. The Tigers didn't really make that Milligan game close at all. They're dropping a few spots for me after that one. Cody had this to say about Campbellsville. Tough loss to the Buffs where Milligan rolled, but the Tigers quickly bounced back and abused Mars Hill to stay afloat. So, I mean, they split, right? They beat Mars Hill. They would lose to Milligan. Now, that is a rivalry game. Was it a complete blowout? Yeah, they lost by 3 scores here. But this was a Milligan team who was rolling. So Campbellsville, previously undefeated, just like Lindsey Wilson, also drops a couple spots here. So for now, they stay tied right here at 15. Now at 14 is Life, who does move up a couple spots. Cody, you have this to say about Life. Gonna sandwich the 500 running Eagles between the team they lost to in OT and the team they beat in OT. That's in Cody's rankings, not ours. And he says, when things are good, it's great. And when they're not, they're not. Brooks still needs to protect the football better, but I like the squad against a handful of other ones in the country nonetheless. Gino had this to say about Life. He said, is Life finally getting over the hump? They get a massive OT win over Thomas for the first win against them in program history. Women's college flag football have this to say about Life. Picked up a massive 34-27 double OT victory against Thomas, showing incredible grit after a wild 6 OT thriller loss earlier in the season. 7-0, like the score loss earlier, OT loss earlier in the season. So there you go, Life. So they dropped a close one to St. Thomas by a score last week. This week, they go ahead and beat Thomas for the first time ever, and so that's definitely something. I mean, that's maybe the biggest win in program history for Life, so congratulations to them, but worth them moving up 3 spots here. Now, at 13 is St. Thomas, who does dip 2 spots. Did not play this weekend, so I don't believe anybody really had anything to say. Yeah, I mean, they got to get back on board here. You have other teams who are winning. St. Thomas just hasn't really had that convincing of a game yet. But we'll see. It's still pretty early on. So there you go. St. Thomas does move down 2 spots as other teams win, though. So there's that. Now at 12 is Thomas, who drops out of the top 10 for the first time ever. We got to cover them in their first season. And pretty much since then, I believe they've been top 10 for a while here. And that's an understatement. They've been like top 5, top 3 for a while. But for the first time ever, they go ahead and drop to 12. And you know what? This is why. This is what Women's College Flag Football had to say about Thomas. Sitting at 4-1 with a plus 86 point differential. They opened with a gritty 15-14 OT win over Reinhardt and just dropped a tight overtime game to Life, 34-27. Gino had this to say about Thomas. Without Destiny Lockett, the Nighthawks suffered a bad OT loss to Life. I'm very concerned about this offense as a whole. Cody had this to say about Thomas. This spot is entirely hinged on Destiny Lockett's health. If it continues to be an issue, I can see the Nighthawks continuing to slide. I still think overall this team should be fine, as they were just undefeated, but it gets tougher than Life University. And yeah, I gotta agree here. Look, offensively, have they looked great? No. I think they might have maybe found an option here in Cam King. She was productive. Still, there's some turnovers here and there, right? But getting the ball out, big playability, right? So there might be something there, but without Destiny Lockett, that definitely puts Thomas in a tough spot. She hasn't played in like 2 weeks now, and so we'll see what happens moving forward for them. But they got to figure out the quarterback spot. It might be a trial by fire. That's okay, right? Whether it's Cam King or Ariana Christian, the 2 young quarterback options they have over there. But when you play in the Sun Conference, one of the toughest conferences for women's college flag football, you got to figure out the quarterback position pretty quickly and commit and just live with the results from there. So we'll see what happens, but right now Thomas is sliding. Now at 11 is Siena Heights here. I don't think they even played this week, so nobody really had anything to say about them. Then moving up was really just other teams losing and just losing to opponents that we didn't feel like were as good. And so right now, Siena Heights does end up moving up a couple of spots because of the chaos from this last week. Now at 10 is Ferrum here. I believe this is the first time ever, third time ever they are ranked. They were not ranked last week, but the last couple weeks they were right at 25. This time they shoot all the way up to 10. This is what Women's College Flag Football had to say about Ferrum. They proved they belong in the elite tier by handling Lindsey Wilson handing Lindsey Wilson a decisive 39-19 loss. Gino had this to say about Ferrum. Easily the biggest risers in the rankings. They took down a red-hot Lindsey Wilson squad pretty easily, and then they absolutely stomped on Hollins. I love what I'm seeing so far and happy to rank them this high after what they did in Week 3. Cody had this to say about Ferrum. The squad not only beat the former ranked number 10 team in the country, they dominated start to finish and staved off a comeback from one of the most explosive units coming into the matchup with mistake-free football. And yeah, I gotta agree, that's a big win over Lindsey Wilson here, but them just playing games and us getting to kind of see what they're all about here, I think they naturally move up. That's a big win over Lindsey Wilson. Now, can they maintain the spot at 10? That is simply a wait and see situation. Now, at 9 is Daytona State, who goes ahead and jumps another 5 spots here, making the top 10, I believe, for the first time ever in our history. Let's go ahead and start with Cody. He says this: how about that? A top 10 appearance from Daytona State. Gino had this to say about Daytona. Big rise for Daytona State with how many teams took a loss in Week 3. And then you have women's college flag football saying this about Daytona State. Number 1 in the composite rankings. They have a flawless 4-0 start and a plus 134 point differential. So there you go, Daytona State. As a result of other teams losing, they rise, and they have looked pretty good to their credit so far. We'll see if they can maintain this spot inside the top 10. Now at 8 is Weber, who is steadily moving up here. Cody had this to say: expected 32-0 win over Bruden Parker. Gino said this about Weber: Weber's locked in so far. The return of Riley Balser has been huge so far on defense for the Warriors. And then you have women's college flag football saying the Sun Conference is deep, and Weber's proving it. QB Herrera threw for 353 yards and 6 touchdowns in their opening win over Hope International. And yeah, I mean, Weber has looked good defensively. I mean, I think I said this in the preview, was not as worried about them. I felt like they returned a pretty experienced squad, and that experience is definitely showing right now. Offensively, it was going to depend on the quarterback play, because the receiving options are obviously there. Riley Balser had her biggest receiving game. We talked about her on defense, or at least Gino did, but offensively, she had her biggest receiving game maybe in her career here, with close to 150 yards, like 11 plus, 10 plus receptions, a touchdown. She did her thing. She is very much healthy. And then obviously you have the rest of the crew with Caitlin Sigmundy, Cheyenne Duran, Emma Balako, Yasmin Lott has been very reliable as a check down option, just to name a few players. This Weber team, they're looking a little underrated here per usual, but they are consistently rising. Now, I will say this last game, Luzariana Herrera struggled a little bit more, a little bit of a sloppier game. We will see if she can bounce back here moving forward. But to be fair, she is a young quarterback. Now, at 7, and this might be a surprise, but at 7 is Kaiser, who moves down 5 spots. This is the first time ever Kaiser, I think, has been ranked outside of our top 5. And so let's talk about it. Cody had this to say about Kaiser, who he has right at 5. An unfortunate loss in the rain amidst injury spoils what would have been a statement weekend for the Seahawks, but this team will be fine and is still amongst contenders in the country. Gino had this to say about Kaiser, who he has at 5. Injuries and just overall complacency on both sides of the ball led Kaiser to yet another disappointing loss to Ottawa. They had that game completely in the bag and still lost. Even after that big win on Wingate, I'm sliding Kaiser down to 5 this week. Women's college flag football had this to say about Kaiser, who is currently ranked at 15 for them. Said QB Ava Wallace is a star, throwing for 503 yards and 11 touchdowns in their first 2 wins. They rebounded nicely from the Ottawa loss with a 61-0 shutout of Reinhardt. But I mean, as you can see, Kaiser moving down for a lot of us here. Look, I think I said this in the preview. I feel like if Ava Wallace played that last drive there to close out the game, Kaiser would have won. Unfortunately, They did not. And, she got hurt, but it looks like she's healthy. She played the next day, played both those games the next day, and that's great to see there. But the concern isn't on the offensive side of the ball. I thought the offense played as well as you could want. I thought Ava Wallace was lights out. When you needed a play, she gave you one. She's looking like an elite quarterback here on the collegiate level, which, if you followed women's college flag football, that's not like a surprise at all. She is an elite talent here. But unfortunately for Kaiser, losing to Ottawa like that is definitely more because the defense allowed 20 points in that second half there. And a lot of it was just through the quarterback, Anna Anderson, just running the ball. And when I was trying to rank Kaiser, just keeping that in mind and seeing that happen, they allowed 20 unanswered points to lose the game. That's just unacceptable, right? And like I said, it's not on the offense, right? The offense has scored, I think, 3+, 4+ touchdowns. If your defense is allowing 20 points in the second half, you can't win that, right? And is it Ottawa? Yes, of course. Absolutely. But let's not act like the other teams ahead of them right now don't also have a high-powered offense. Potentially even better at this point in the season. And so with those questions in mind, Kaiser really needs to shore up and just play better on the defensive side of the football. The touchdown they allowed, Kaiser was playing man-to-man, or at least it looked that way, but they didn't communicate it because one corner took the other, cutting off the other corner on the outside, and then allowed a wide-open touchdown. Even then, if you look at that play, Kaiser had another player in the back of the end zone that was wide open as well. Those are just mistakes you cannot make, especially against a Ottawa team that is starting a freshman quarterback that is playing their first game of the season. Kaiser has played like 3 or 4 other games before this. There's just no excuse for that. And so other teams are playing well right now. Kaiser, unfortunately, just did not play well against Ottawa. And so even beating Wingate, who's a first-year program, that's just not going to save them from sliding here. And so right now, Kaiser's going to go ahead and slide to 7. We will see if they could bounce back here. They're going to play some tough opponents, right? Because they're contending in the Sun Conference. But I think for our voters, for them to move up, the defense has to play better. That's just it. Shout out the offense, shout out Ava Wallace. She looks elite, generational even, you could say that. I'm not afraid to throw that out there. But there is only so much a generational quarterback could do. And a generational offense, if we're being completely honest there as well. You gotta have a little bit of defense here going, especially when you have that upper hand. So it is what it is. Now, moving ahead of them at 6 is Milligan, who slides ahead 1 spot. This is what Cody said. Quickly silencing doubts, Milligan went around and absolutely buried teams this season. Gino said this about Milligan: this offense is really starting to get rolling here for the Buffaloes. The squad has a ridiculous amount of talent at receiver between Rumrow, McDowell, both Quinn sisters, and Ashton Weirley. I don't know if they're sisters or not. Could be wrong, though. Women's college flag football, I have this to say about Milligan: a highly battle-tested team. They notched a quality win over a tough Campbellsville team 28-6 and took down Huntington 33-19. And you can't argue with that. Both teams, as well as Mars Hill, were teams that are ranked in our top 25. Now, was it near the bottom? Yes, of course. But, they won in convincing fashion, and they're also undefeated, so can't argue with that right now. Now, moving on, at 5 is Kansas Wesleyan, who also moves up a spot. Cody had this to say about K-Dub: more to do with Florida Gateway surge than anything for their drop. Still a damn good squad. Gino had this to say about Kansas Wesleyan. Actually had nothing to say about Kansas Wesleyan, so there you go. And then women's college flag football had this to say about them. Quarterback Shihiro Wado led the Coyotes to a massive 73-0 season opening win over Heston, throwing for 6 touchdowns. I believe they played another exhibition this last week here. But, they look dominant so far. They're going to be tested this week, though. We will see what happens. There could be some room for them to move up or down. But I will say, for them at this point, it's mostly looking down unless they beat in Ottawa, who is right ahead of them. And at 4 right now is Ottawa, who also slides. They move down 3 spots. I want to say this is the farthest Ottawa has slid in our rankings. Cody had this to say about Ottawa. This feels like an awkward spot, but I just could not bring myself to put them any lower. He has them at 3 in his personal rankings. He said they defeated Kaiser in the rain through poise, playmaking, and opportunity, showing they still owned that matchup psychologically. Wingate played them close, and then they lose to Florida Gateway, and that is why I dropped them at all. They're still a national contender, and I think losing this early in the season truly only makes this team more dangerous per usual, and I have to agree with that. This is what Gino had to say about Ottawa. You had the stellar comeback against Kaiser to defend their belt once again, but then they got squashed against Florida Gateway. I'm really interested to see what this new look Ottawa squad does against teams like Baker and Kansas Wesleyan. Women's college flag football has Ottawa at 14, says our highest ranked one-loss team secured a massive 32-28 victory over Sun Conference heavyweight Kaiser, though they did drop to newly number 1 Florida Gateway. Number 1 in their rankings, Florida Gateway. So yeah, a little bit of a mixed bag from Ottawa this week. Honestly, looking at this matchup in the preseason, it was really hard to believe that Ottawa wouldn't have come out of this week with 1 loss, right? They're playing Kaiser, who's tough. They're playing Florida Gateway, who obviously is tough, right? They're playing Wingate in its own, you know? I felt like they were going to be a very good D2 team, and that did end up being a good game for Ottawa. And so, unfortunately, though, they go 2-1. They do beat Kaiser, but they fall to Florida Gateway. You know, Ottawa would be closer to the top if it wasn't for that Florida Gateway game just really not being close at all. I do think it is interesting that news of the Sauer sisters leaving for Nebraska after the season broke after that Kaiser game. I can't tell if it was during the Florida Gateway game or maybe just a little bit after, but that timeline seems really close there. Either way, it just did not seem like that team played like their usual selves in that Florida Gateway game, and then even then against Wingate, right? They kind of let Wingate hang around for a really long time over there. And so a week removed, it's been a busy week, 3 games, a lot of news going around, right? The Sauer sisters are there to finish the season. And let's talk about Ottawa, right? I think quarterback-wise, with the win over Kaiser, they have shown that they have a quarterback in Anna Anderson who could potentially win them a national championship. She fits their system, needing a dual threat, right? She tore up Kaiser on the ground. Also threw some nice passes, you know, as well. You know, she is a dual threat quarterback who will give teams some fits, especially because, you know, outside of Baker, who has Tara Lorente, you know, how many other successful dual threat quarterbacks are there going to be that are contending this year, right? So we'll see what happens, but, you know, they still look like they got it, and even with the loss at the end of the season, what's stopping them from winning it again? We've seen this script before. Seeing Anna Anderson play well, I think, was key for a lot of us to continue to have confidence in Ottawa. Now, they're at 4, right? But it's because other teams have played better. Them being at 4 doesn't mean that they are out of it, though. So just keep that in mind. I thought defensively, they played well. They got a lot of veterans over there. Shout out Jacani Washington. She made a great pick against Kaiser. Just waiting on that one. The defense looked really good. Offensively, you know, they still got weapons. Spielberg, Dos Santos, Linkus, they're going to always do their thing. You could expect that to happen. They are always going to do their thing. And so, although they lose to Florida Gateway, that is a good test of moving forward here. And something to learn from. So we'll see how this Ottawa team responds here. There is plenty of time to respond. You got to keep in mind, this was their first games of the season last week. But for now, they are at 4. Now, at 3, just barely here, is Baker, who does move ahead of Ottawa. This is what Cody had to say about Baker. I'm not going to punish Baker for Florida Gateway's surge, so here they rest undefeated and heading home after taking care of business in Arizona with good film from Ottawa and Kaiser. Nice. Gino had this to say about Baker. Baker went out to Arizona and showed them what KCAC football is all about. The Terra Lorente MVP campaign is definitely off to a good start so far. Women's college flag football is Baker ranked at 3, and this is what they had to say about them. Securing dominant wins out west, most recently cruising to a 46-0 shutout over Benedictine Mesa and 40-20 win over Arizona Christian. So, as of right now, Baker's undefeated, and they had a very busy week. I think they played 4 games over there. They played Midland, and by the way, none of these games were close, but they played Midland, beat them by a whole bunch here. Probably more than some of us expected. We knew they'd be good, but they already looked to be in maybe mid-season form, so that's definitely a good thing for Baker. But then they go to Arizona. They have 3 teams, and at this point, you gotta think about, you gotta think about fatigue setting in here. That's 4 games in a week. I think 4 games in 4 days, maybe 3 days, and a whole bunch of travel, right? And they win pretty well here. Arizona Christian game got a little close, 40-20, I guess, is the closest. But other than that, Terra Lorente is on a tear. The offense looks good. Defensively, they seemed locked in here. They won big games against who they're supposed to, despite the travel fatigue and all that stuff. That is definitely something to keep in mind here. And I will say this, out of everyone here, I actually have Baker ranked the highest. I have them at 2. And that's no shade against Florida Gateway, any of these other teams. And I'll say my reason right here. Florida Gateway barely got by Elise McRae, a first-year program, right? Baker did not barely get by first-year programs. They dominated 3 of them in a row at that back-to-back. Or, sorry, 2, I think 2 of them were back-to-back, and then 1 from the night before. And that's after beating an established program in Midland a couple days earlier. So there is definitely something to be said about the conditioning of Baker. And, of course, they're undefeated, too. So cannot argue with that. For now, they stay here. Will they maintain it? They're going to have to maintain it by beating Ottawa and Kansas Wesleyan, taking care of stuff in conference. But for now, I believe they look pretty good. So that's why I have them personally at 2, and they have risen to 3 for us in our PMC rankings. Now, as we approach the final 2 teams here, I will just have to say, it's been a busy week 3, so do not be surprised. For the first time ever in all the years we have done rankings, these PMC rankings, we've done them since 2023, I believe, starting with the NAI level. We have never ever in that's 40 weeks of ranking, have had 2 teams tied at number 1. Those 2 teams, for the first time ever, tied at number 1 is Warner and Florida Gateway, both teams undefeated right now. Let's actually go ahead and start talking about Warner here. Obviously, for us to have a tie, a couple things have to happen here, but as far as our panel goes, we were split. Half of us had Warner, the other half had Florida Gateway, and the points just ended up working out there. But let's go ahead and talk about Warner. This is what Cody had to say about them. He was one of the ones who had them at number 1 in their own rankings. He said this: no team has looked more dominant. The firepower is absurd. The pass rush is game-wrecking. The defense is stout. Just an absolute force of nature thus far into the season. Gino had this to say about Warner: I'm not sure who is going to be able to stop this team. Their offense and defense are on a different level right now. Women's college flag football, they have Warner at 2. This is what they said. This Sun Conference powerhouse opened the season looking unstoppable. They are winning by an average of 75 points per game here. Look, they have not, I don't believe they have played a ranked team yet. Hope might have been the closest team, and they dismantled them. But regardless of who they've played, this team looks good. And they're going to get challenged here soon. They play in the Sun Conference, so, we'll see if they're able to maintain this number 1 spot here. They don't play Florida Gateway, unfortunately. At least I don't believe so. We'll see who maintains this number 1 spot, but they're undefeated. And not only are they undefeated, but they've been winning by a lot of points here. Katherine Hutchinson is playing at a very high level. The weapon she has, the four-headed monster, it feels like, of Jess Finley, Anna Vincenzini, Avalon Lux Offerman, and Mariah Gordon has been unstoppable, unguardable, arguably. And then you have the defensive side of the ball led by Lauren Clark and company. Lauren Clark, Marion Torero, Vincenzini, a lot of the same names that I mentioned on offense. They are also playing at a high level. They are, I think, on a 4-game winning streak of forcing multiple turnovers and sacks in a game here, or I think more than 3 sacks and turnovers in a game. You don't do that by not being well coached and talented. And so Warner has dominated so far. It's going to be a question of seeing whether they can keep it up here, but you cannot deny how dominant they have been. I will say this. I believe this might be the first time ever that Warner is ranked number 1 in our rankings. They got really close a couple of times. They have been getting close the last couple of years, but it really feels like, at least at this point in time, after week 3, that Warner deserves to be recognized as the number 1 team. But on top of that, you have Florida Gateway, who is tied for number 1 for a reason. Let's go ahead and start with womenscollegeflagfootball.com. They have them ranked at number 1. They said this: proven they can win against a top-tier 4-year programs, recently taking down Ottawa and Lise McRae here. Gino had this to say about Florida Gateway, who he had at 2, but still said, taking down the 5-time reigning national champs is enough to slide into that top 2. Only reason they aren't number 1 is because Warner is simply on a different planet at the moment. Cody had this to say about Florida Gateway. After defeating the number 1 team in the country, you get their spot. The Wolves showed levels to their program in the Reinhardt tournament, and I am only sad they didn't get to play Kaiser. And actually, I am a little bit sad about that too, because I will say this, they won pretty decently against Ottawa. Right? It was a good win. Dominant win. It was Ottawa's second game, though, after a tough game against Kaiser. Now, personally, I don't know how the other people here would have voted, but personally, if Florida Gateway went on and played Kaiser and they beat them, not even like blowout, just beat them in general, right? I would probably have Florida Gateway at number 1, undisputed. For now, I think it's fair to say that they deserve to be tied with Warner for the number 1 spot because, this just wasn't a decision taken lightly. Myself, the other people that are ranking over here, we went back and forth. We discussed it all weekend long. Warner, Florida Gateway, Warner, Florida Gateway. Who are we going to put up here, right? Who are we going to crown number 1 after week 3? Now, does it matter a whole bunch after week 3? I don't know. We'll see. But at this point here, they've beat, we've always known this, they've beat 4-year programs, right? Is it harder for them to do it? Absolutely, because they are a junior college. Absolutely harder for them to do it. Shout out Coach Hufty over there. He's a real one. He realistically should be getting one of these Power 4 jobs soon, is what I'm just going to say, if he hasn't already been courted. And if you are not like an NCAA program trying to recruit this coach, I just have no idea what you are trying to do right now. That's just all I'm going to say right there. But anyways, he has built a fantastic program that has shown they do not need players for 4 years. They could bring him in right away and get him going. 2 years tops. And then you go on from there. And they have sustained the success. And so you got to feel great about Florida Gateway and what they've done. But Warner does exist. You cannot deny the firepower that Warner has. They are going right now. You cannot deny the defensive firepower they have either. They are going. Unlike Florida Gateway, they have not struggled in a game yet. Now, can that change soon here? Absolutely. We are still very early on in the season, not even the midway point, right? So we will see what happens. But I think this right now feels right. Warner and Florida Gateway tied at 1. We'll see who is able to prevail moving forward. It's very close. like a minuscule shift, will drop 1 to 2 and the other 1 to 1. That is how close it'll be. And so we'll see what happens, but things are getting super exciting here in the country as the women's college flag football season is in full swing. And even then, the East Coast hasn't really kicked off yet. No, actually, maybe a little bit, but they will have more teams kicking off this next week as we enter March. And so, there you go. Those are our rankings after a very eventful week 3. Once more, just out is William Woods, Marymount, Hope, Graceland, Point, St. Francis, Arizona Christian, Cumberland, Alabama State, King, Emmanuel, and Cypress. At 25 is Lisa McRae, 24 Southwestern, 23 Barton College, 22 Mount St. Mary's, 21 Nevada State, 20 Saddleback, 19 Midland, 18 Irvine Valley, 17 Wingate. Tied at 15 is Lindsey Wilson and Campbellsville, 14 Life, 13 St. Thomas, 12 Thomas, 11 Siena Heights, 10 Ferrum, 9 Daytona State, 8 Weber, 7 Kaiser, 6 Milligan, 5 Kansas Wesleyan, 4 Ottawa, 3 Baker, and tied at 1 for the first time ever is Warner and Florida Gateway, your new number ones here in the country for now. Okay, and that'll be it for this episode. Thank you so much for rocking with us. And I gotta slow it down here just a little bit because I really just want to emphasize how thankful we are to be able to get to 500 episodes. First off, let me talk about the crew here that has helped us out and everyone who has supported us all the way through here. We've been doing this since 2020. Well, sorry, not Playmaker's Corner, but we've been doing a podcast since 2020. It's gone under changes, and then it was officially Playmaker's Corner in the summer of 2020. So that is true still technically. And, you know, we've had so much help, so many great people who has helped us out, but we've also had so many great people who have worked on this podcast. And so I'm going to take a moment to shout out everyone. Cody, Gino, of course. You know, we got Mason out here who's helped us out. Gideon has helped us out a whole bunch here. Him and Phoenix, our 2 interns, have helped us so much over these last couple years, and now both of them, well, Phoenix has already graduated, I believe, but Gideon will be graduating soon here, so he's basically been with us through the bulk of this journey, and I tell him this all the time. I probably could do it more still, but I can't tell him how much I appreciate him as well as all the other guys who has helped us out. Shout out our guy Jesse, who's helped us out a whole bunch. Liam, who's helped us out a whole bunch. So many people who's been on the pod. I have to make sure I shout all of them out. They've been great. Then, of course, shout out all of our supporters here in Colorado. We are Colorado-based here. You know, unfortunately, had to stop doing high school coverage. And, you know, there's a little bit of an announcement here. I'm actually just going to go ahead and say it right here. And then, I don't know, if you're still paying attention, you're going to be here for it. And so when this announcement comes out in the summer, you probably won't be too surprised. But we're gonna resume our girls' high school flag football coverage. I will say this, myself, Cody, Gino, and Mason are all coaches here. So, you know, I'm just going to be honest, there's going to be a little bit of bias, but we want to make sure we continue to spotlight, you know, the fantastic athletes here in Colorado who, you know, are doing their thing right now. At this moment, and I'm shouting her out, but at this moment, I am watching Kansas Wesleyan versus Midland here, and there are 2 Colorado linebackers playing for them on both sides, Jocelyn Huntsman and Ducky Archuleta. You know, those are 2 players that we got to cover throughout their career playing flag football here in Colorado, and we want to come back to that. We want to cover Colorado girls high school flag football. We've always wanted to do that, and we want to make sure that they continue to get the spotlight that they deserve. And so it might look a little bit different from what we've done before, but we want to find a way to continue to covering those great athletes here because we have great athletes to offer. That's just straight up, right? You look at all the great players like in Avalon, Lux Offerman, Sailor Swanson, Addie Cadwell, just to name a few that are playing really well right now. It's not a coincidence. You know, we're a small state, population-wise and program-wise, but we find a way to compete with the top-tier levels, and we want to make sure those athletes here, you know that and help build that culture a little bit more. And so that's a big announcement that I wanted to go ahead and say right there. Since this is episode 500, we will be making a return to Colorado here soon. But outside of Colorado, shout out man, shout out Florida, shout out the East Coast, shout out Georgia, shout out the people, our friends in Arizona, Nevada, California, everywhere, Kansas. We've had so many people listen to this podcast. Also, shout out Texas, of course. And we just appreciate how much people appreciate us doing our thing. We don't get paid. Not really. I think at most we got some ad revenue from last year, but that went to all of our travels, right? But this year, obviously, you don't see any ads. And so with that being said, I mean, we truly do it for the love of the game. We want to cover history here. I don't know if you're going to find any other media that has been covering women's college flag football as detailed as us. We take so much pride in this. We take so much pride in protecting the legacies of these athletes, of these coaches, and of these programs, and telling their stories. That is why we are here. We enjoy it so much. I mean, like I said, none of us get paid from it or are really benefiting from it personally. None of us are at the moment, but we don't need to. I think protecting the legacy of this game and of the pioneers that have come forth and done this thing and continue to do it, and they're not going to be the only ones after us. That's awesome. We want to make sure we cover the early days of women's college flag football as well as we can. And so, like I said, we don't do it for the love or the money, but we do it for the love of the game. But that doesn't mean we don't appreciate every single listener out there. It means the absolute world to us, and just know it's appreciated every time somebody says that. I know we must have said we appreciate you a whole bunch to a whole bunch of people, but we genuinely mean that. It definitely means a lot to us because we do work really hard at both mastering this craft and making sure we do a good job. It matters that we do a good job, not because we get a pay hit or anything like that if we do a bad job, but because there are people's stories that need to be told the right way. So there you go there. And then because it's me and not Cody or Gino over here, I gotta just last shout out. I just got an extra shout out my home state of Texas, sanctioned girls high school flag football. Sanctioned girls high school flag football. That is it. That is all I want to see. Oh my God. If I could go down to Texas and start a podcast and cover it all over again, just like I did here in Colorado until it is sanctioned, I will do that. Financially, can I afford that? No, but that is something I would absolutely love to do, and I encourage somebody else to do it. Somebody else take up that banner. We need more people down in Texas to get this thing going for real. It is ridiculous that we have college flag football teams before official varsity high school flag football teams. It is time to complete football in Texas. That's all I'm saying. Other than that, thank you so much for rocking with us. We appreciate each and every one of you. Make sure you check us out at Playmaker's Corner on social media so you know when the next episodes are dropping. We should be on that routine Tuesday, Thursdays, but, there are also graphics that drop in between, which, we talk about on the episode, but, maybe some people need some visuals. So those will be there as well. And then on top of that, check out playmakerscorner.com. Speaking of history and protecting legacies, we are continuously updating that with stuff that we post from this season, but you can also find there a whole bunch of things from our previous seasons of us covering women's college flag football. So there you go there. Once again, thank you so much. From the bottom of our heart, appreciate it so much, and we will catch you next time.